so excited to have Mike Ananny here. Mike is a professor at USC in the Annenberg School, and he is also a co-director of the Generative AI, the Center on Generative AI in Society. He is most recently author of the book Networked Press Freedom. I've read the book very carefully. I just thought I would have it off the tip of my head. It's not because I don't know what it is. And we're just really excited to have Mike here. All of his work is sort of at the intersection of media, technology, and journalism. And I can say he is one of my favorite people to talk to and to read about these issues of how society and technology are entangled. So I'm really excited to hear his talk today. Thanks for coming, everyone.
Thank you so much.
I forgot. CGMD. I am the co-director with Matt Powers. This is a CGMD event, and if you want to see more events, the QR code will lead you to our schedule. The next event, we have Jisoo Kim, who is our most recent faculty member in the department, talking about why everything feels political, which is very relevant to everything everybody thinks about. So please come.
That's what I'm going to talk about. No,
right.
It's all good. Okay, let me see if I can switch this back over. Yay. Okay, awesome. Adrian, thank you so much, both and to you and to Matt, for the invitation to be here, to get to spend time. This is a department and a school that's been near and dear to my heart, and I've been fond of and have followed all the work happening here very closely for years and years, and it's great to see old friends and colleagues again as well. What I thought I would do today is, so I honestly, we were talking a little bit about it before the talk started. I'll be blunt and say, I feel like I've been kicked, dragging and screaming into caring about or studying AI, and it's not something that I necessarily set out to do, wanted to do, but maybe like many of you in the room, it's almost impossible to avoid these days thinking about your work in relation to this topic, this keyword. And as the abstract for today mentioned, I really take to heart Lucy Suchman's call to be skeptical of the, quote, thingness of AI, and to make sure that we keep the thingness, the quality of the object, whatever this thing called AI is. She calls us to sort of keep it flexible, keep it contingent, keep it political, and make sure that we're not constantly in this sort of call and response relationship to whatever big tech tells us is the meaning of AI, or big tech tells us is how we should care or not care about AI. It's meant to be something that I've been sort of thinking a lot about is, how do you retain your voice, your identity, your political commitments, your investments as a scholar in this moment where it can feel like you're being buffeted a little bit. It can feel like you're being dragged into one topic versus another. So I just say that really sort of bluntly and honestly, that if you feel an inkling of that, I share it. And what I want to talk about today is a little bit of my attempt to try to work with that feeling and to think about what kinds of questions or investments could we make that keep the politics, that keep the socio-technical relationships foregrounded and alive. This is like, I gathered some of these, so it's a hobby, I gathered them over the last sort of 6 months or so, but open up any news site of any kind, these kinds of headlines are constantly here. This is the kind of thing, it almost feels ridiculous to start a talk with these days, but there is no shortage of either panic or hype or certainty or marketing or some lens of what the heck AI is meant to be or what it's not and how you should or should not engage with it. No shortage of controversies, no shortage of perspectives of what they're there. But I take to heart, as I mentioned earlier, this sort of piece, Dawn Nafis, or Nafis, I'm always mispronouncing her name, so I'm sure someone in the room knows better than I do. But Dawn sort of observed that the last 4S, the big Science Technology Studies conference, it was something like 73% of papers were in some way related to AI. And she sort of had this moment of questioning, what the heck has happened to our field or our discipline when so much of our attention has been focused on this thing? And I recommend it, it's a really nice piece where she sort of says, how do you reconcile with this focus, this attention? How do you hold on to your own identity, your own investment as a scholar, while at the same time be part of these fields and these conversations? So Don asks us, sort of what are we holding on to when we hold on to AI, even at a critical distance? Because there's also sort of a history of sort of criticality and thinking about we're going to challenge the politics of something, but she sort of says, let's question the centering of that. So my own perspective on this is I try to keep in mind what is AI a case of, and I find whether it's with my students or my colleagues that I talk to, this question of what is AI a case of, I find if somebody doesn't really have an answer to that question, or if they're not sure, or if they say it's obvious, to me that's a bit of a moment of pause and saying let's go back to social theory, let's go back to sort of political theory of various kinds, and try to make AI a case of something, even or especially if it doesn't present that way. So the focus for me today that I want to talk about, the way I think about AI as a case of something connects to longstanding interests I've had in sort of political theory and explicitly what the heck a public is. And it's sort of, I'm sure many of you have these questions that grab onto you kind of can't let go of, even if you don't mean to, but I still come back to this word public, and I don't know what it means exactly. I keep hearing people use it in lots of ways, and I come back to it again and again and again. So what I'm trying to do with this AI work is think about how can this frame of public, how can this contestation of this word public, keeping public light and flexible and not a thing in the way that Suchman tells us, how can we use that to try to make sense of this moment? And narrowing that a little bit further is I think about what the heck a public problem is. And I'll say that I'm very much in a pragmatist, materialist tradition, people like John Dewey, who think about publics are things that are made. They're made through communication, they're made through sharing consequences, they're made through being in relation to each other in ways that are sort of orthogonal to interests. It doesn't matter if you're interested in a public problem, the public problem is interested in you. So it's a different word than community, it's a different word than interest, it's a different word than group. It's sort of this notion of shared consequences. And my cursory reading of sort of, I've been trying to pay attention to and trying to think about it, and I don't go into all this, I won't go into it, but there's a lot of people trying to make AI into a public problem in a lot of different kinds of ways. And just as public is this word that means lots of different kinds of things, there's understandably a lot of different ways to try to make AI a public problem. So some people see the publicness of AI as this thing that has to be regulated by states or by interests that are living in legislation. Other people think about it as a bureaucratic tool that maybe states should be using to solve public problems. Maybe you can get at a public problem better if you're using AI. Sometimes it's an object of sort of concern or an object of deployment for public-facing institutions. Think about journalism, thinking about civic media. More existentially, maybe this AI is sort of a challenge to long-standing notions of what the heck a public sphere is, and very much infused with sort of Habermasian deliberative democracy notions of public sphere. What does it mean to bring truth to a discussion when that truth is, wrong at least 8% of the time, or whatever hallucination rate you want to bring into? And then we have a bunch of people talking about it. I'm heavily interested by Northrop Morris's work on sort of AI as a super controversy, trying to, you see in all this work, people grasping for a difference. They're grasping for some sort of material difference in this moment. And the answer is sort of, it might be different, it might not be. But what I want to do today to focus on, if you buy this sort of lack of comfort with this term AI and this focus on publics, and then this further narrowing to try to say what the heck is a public problem? How is AI a public problem? How is it made to be a public problem? I want to talk about three scenes or three places where I think AI is being made into a public problem. So public problems, my advisor used to say, they're never found naturally in the wild. The same way you don't find news in the wild. Journalism is not something that exists in the wild. News is made. It's made by institutions. It's made by people. It's made by practices. It's made by all these things. So the same way that you don't find news in the wild, you don't find problems in the wild. Problems have to be made. So I'm curious about how do these problems get made? And that's the guiding question for these three scenes that I want to talk about of how AI is made into a public problem. And the three I'll talk about is one is sort of thinking about it as a discursive achievement. It's a thing that's made through discourse. The other is it's a thing that's made by talking about accountability. So who's accountable for some problem? Who's at fault? Who's to blame? Who should fix it? And it's also, and this is the focus on journalism, it's also maybe a professional challenge. It's to say AI is a problem to the extent that this profession is ready or not ready to deal with it as a problem. So those are the three things I want to go into it. Brief little theory interlude, and I don't really want to go into this, but I kind of want to put my cards on the table a little bit to say, I'm going to use some words, like AI, error or problem, and publics. And this is not meant for you to sort of engage with really deeply, but I really take sort of a socio-technical perspective on what the heck AI is. It's this collision of people and materials and practices and data and institutions and norms. And I want to hold on to this term AI a little bit loosely, and I want to hold on to that loosely with purpose and with intention, and not sort of have it be collapsed or brought down to a single thing. I'm also drawing upon or inspired by a lot of work in STS around thinking about errors and failures and breakdowns, and there's a lot of words that are sort of similar in that realm, but there's a lovely body of literature, thinking about Steve Jackson's work on broken world thinking, but thinking about where errors come from, how they're made to be errors, who suffers errors or failures or breakdowns perhaps unevenly, and how the encounters with errors or failures or breakdowns can be almost little socio-diagnostics. They're ways of seeing power. They're ways of seeing how our power circulates. I'm also thinking here of Gina Neff's work on permanently beta, right? This idea that errors are often ways to see how risk has been distributed in a society. So if you don't care whether a particular system that you encounter fails or not, chances are there's a certain kind of privilege that insulates you from that risk. If you're really close to that chance of a problem, you're really close to that chance of a failure or a breakdown, chances are you're skating pretty close to the edge. You might not have a lot of social or political reserves to deal with to sort of insulate yourself from errors. So anyway, errors and problems and breakdowns are sort of, to me, these interesting things that show us ways into questions of power. And then, as I mentioned, this sort of, I'll put my sort of Deweyan cards on the table and say I think about publics as these material communicative constructs, right? They're made by that way. Okay, to get a little bit narrower then, oh, my timer always times out. Here's the claim, the specific claim I want to make today and thinking about today is that generative AI becomes a public problem when accounts of it, quotes, failures, articulate ideals of publics. And I'll unpack what I mean by that, but I want you to keep alive this idea that there's going to be things called failures or errors or breakdowns, and I'm going to use those terms a little interchangeably with apologies for lack of precision there. But there's that world of errors, failures, breakdowns. And then there's these ideals of public. These sort of ideals of what we think public should mean, what people want it to mean, what people work toward it meaning. And when you see scenes of failure, I think you see types of public at play. Likewise, if you're invested in a particular type of public, you want public to mean something, you're probably going to go look for particular types of failure, or maybe you're just going to care about particular types of failure versus other kinds of failure. But I want to use this as an exercise to try to think about these two things in concert with each other, failures and publics. And I'll do that in three different ways. Okay, the first scene I want to talk about of sort of public problems and failures in relation to generative AI, I'm sort of loosely calling these charismatic embraces and refusals. And there's a long history of sort of charisma, hype, thinking about how particular individuals in society have power to both embody normative perspectives, to call things out as problematic, to celebrate some things, to denigrate some other things. There's a really lovely sort of sub-literature of work thinking about how that manifests sometimes as charm, sometimes as charisma, sometimes as sort of ideologies that are embedded in places. So Fred Turner's recent work on sort of the Texan ideology in comparison to the California ideology. We've got these sort of circulations of, I'd say, sort of normativities that are all about rewarding the charming people, and the not so charming people don't get to be in the conversation, and the people can also be in the form of ideologies. I think what's happening is we're often seeing this in terms of AI as well. And so I want to think about how a particular set of people, of types of charisma, of charm, are often in these sort of battles to say, is AI a wonderful thing? Is it the future of humanity? It's going to solve all the climate problems that it's supposedly creating? Or is it an existential threat and it's the downfall of society? I won't go through all these in detail, but again, you can sort of open any news site and you see the embodiment, you see the personalization, the individualization of a lot of perspectives of whether AI is a problem or whether AI is a solution. But this sort of grappling with AI as a problem, it's impossible to do without grappling with, I would say, these, not just these, but many other people, but people in general, individuals who have these beliefs. Some of these, and I want to say this sort of really bluntly, I don't have any particular beef with any of these people as individuals, but what I want to do is to try to foreground and say, these are characters, these are charmful, charismatic people who are circulating within, but also helping to construct the types of discourses that make AI into a problem or not. So how do they do some of this? These are just a few examples, but I have a paper I'm happy to share that goes into a lot more detail on this. But we've got a bunch of different sort of mechanisms, a bunch of open letters, right? Open letters, probably many of you are asked to sign them or asked to sign the counter opening letter, whatever it is. Letters asking us to pause AI completely, letters saying AI should be rejected completely, letters saying that AI is an experiment that must be continued. But literally the act of sort of adding your name to these letters is often a case of embodying and individualizing a perspective on whether AI is a problem or not. We've also got some really heavy hitter large figures. As I was walking here, I saw some of the names of these people on buildings around campus as I was going. So these people they're with us. They're with us physically all the time. But these are people who are having different disagreements about what it is. So I'm happy to answer more questions on this, but I think probably this resonates a little bit where it's at least passes a smell test of you've encountered this sort of individuality that's here. So what's going on here? If I had to get a little bit more analytical about what is happening with these charmed, charismatic individuals who are making AI into a problem or saying AI is not a problem, but they're having this fight. So the first thing I think that we have here, and I can talk about more empirical data I'm basing this on, is but we've got these competing problem frames. So this is in the tradition of media framing, long-standing sort of way of thinking about this work. We have it as an existential risk. Some people say it's a problem of simply concentrated power. It's not what people are doing with the power, it's that the power is concentrated. The systems are opaque. There's structural inequalities. We're suffering this problem of iteration where we're always having to suffer bad AI over and over again. Maybe it's an education literacy problem. Maybe it's a timeline problem. Just wait a little bit longer. It's going to get better or it's going to get good enough. But we have these competing problem frames that are there. We also have a bunch of calls for action, whether that's pausing AI, whether that's building literacy, whether that's creating transparency, audit the systems, apply regulations, devolve the power that some people have. There's sort of calls for these actions. And then these individuals, these people, have sort of personal legitimacies. They have authorities that they're sort of resting upon. And sometimes those are people who started companies. Sometimes those are academics with very strong social media followings. Over my years, I've been shocked to learn sometimes that some academics who walk amongst us have like publicists and stylists and people who are agents, and I'm just sort of like jaw-droppingly naive, and I'm like, this is how this works? And I'm like, yeah, I guess it is how it works. But I just want to say that these are these types of personalities and charismatic individuals that are amongst us, and that's a type of power that I think we ignore at our peril. So what kind of public is this? So I'm going to posit or say that the public here is a mass to be activated. There are these embodied, these agonistic, these affective, strategic, charismatic individuals who are sort of almost acting as fiduciaries for us. They're taking care of us. They're embodying our outrage. You might agree with some of them, you might disagree with some of them. You probably identify with some of them, maybe you don't identify with others. But there's a sort of a charismatic embodiment of the problematic quality of AI. That's the public that's circulating. And we get to watch it, we get to observe it. Sometimes we're called to maybe sign a letter, to participate in it, but we are a public that's sort of ready to be activated and called into service by charisma. And I want to say, I think that's one of the types of publics that's sort of happening here, is we're waiting to do it. Okay, the second scene I want to talk about is what I'd almost call these inventories of failure. So again, there's a cottage industry here of dashboards, databases, data sets, inventories of moments when AI has been seen to break down, to fail, to make a mistake of some kind, to cause an error of some kind. These are just a few. I'll show a couple other examples. I can never do this acronym, the AIAAIC database. A charismatic figure should take this over and rebrand it in some way. But it's a database, right? It's a database of sort of failures and controversies and moments that's maintained by a group in the UK. There's the Partnership on AI, has their incident database. They're really interesting things to peruse and to sort of delve into, because what gets to count as entry into one of these databases is sort of a source of judgment. It's an evidence of judgment that's there. There's a bunch of different other examples. This is the AI Global Group. So this one, they're focused on sort of geographic, especially north-south distribution of errors and erroneous events or failures of AI around the world in different ways. So they sort of more foreground maps and location as sort of the way to make sense of errors that are here. The OECD has similarly another inventory of errors and failures and breakdowns in AI. They similarly match it with news stories about the errors as well as placement onto maps. So that's their interest, is sort of mapping a particular geography of an error or failure to a more in-depth discussion or description of that error. This is one I love. A colleague, friend Jonathan Gray has one he calls snapshots or troubling AI. He wants you to take snapshots of moments when AI fails and breaks down and send it to him. And I kind of love the almost intimacy of this, because we probably all had moments, whether you're talking to a chatbot or something, but you're like, wow, that messed up in some way, right? So this is, again, a more sort of casual, almost sort of intimate way to spam call, way to think about where error is coming from. But again, there's many, many different sort of examples of these. These are sort of cottage industries of these inventories. So what's going on here? Again, with some analytical distance and thinking about this sort of set of empirical examples that we have here, how are these building up to particular publics? How are they evidence of particular dynamics of how publics make themselves? I'd argue it's a few different ways. The first is sort of these types of erroneous accounts or accounts of erroneous AI. They label or they foreground incidents. They want to talk about risks. They want to codify and often quantify harms. They're usually based in events. There's something that happened. It's a flashpoint event. These are not long-term sort of structural genealogical accounts. Something happened in a moment. There's different kinds of accounts and representations that drive these inventories of error. So they're maps, they're also juxtapositions, there's summaries, journalistic accounts, leaderboards, taxonomy. There's sort of a way of thinking about this as a thing that is meant to be analytically distanced and talked about in these terms. But likewise, a little bit, you have this invitation to participate. You can search, you can use one of the APIs or application programming interfaces to access these inventories. You're asked to submit your own events where AI has messed up in some way. You can volunteer for any of these kinds of things. So what kind of public is this, I would say? And again, I want to posit or claim here to say there's a different type of public at work here than there was with the charismatic or charmed individuals. The public here are these people who are impacted or represented or outraged by these observed and aggregated and indexed and sorted events. This is sort of an event-based account of what error means and what failure means. This is not about sort of long genealogical power struggles. This is about trying to make sense of events. And you're asked, we as publics are asked to understand them. We're asked to engage in maybe contributing and making them. We're asked to compare them. We're maybe asked to find our own analyses of what they are, but we're asked to do some of the meaning making of these events. And it's not a better or worse way of making publics than the first way, but I think we've already got two very different ways of thinking about how AI is problematic, how it is made to be a problem. Okay, the last one I want to do, and then I want to posit, I was using this as an example I want to introduce a fourth one, more just selfishly to ask you to help me think about it, but there's a fourth one I'm thinking about as well for today. But the third one I want to talk about is this sort of lives in this world of professional practice, and specifically journalistic practice. This is a profession and a practice. I know many of you in the room probably know this, way better than I do. This is a profession that thrives on claims of fact-making, of being truthful. At my school, if you, as a student, make a factual error in a news story that you submit for an assignment, you're supposed to immediately get a 0 because we have the zero tolerance policy for errors. In practice, that's not how it works, but it's a profession that prides itself on getting it 100% right? You're not supposed to. And there's a culture of retractions and corrections. There's lawsuits that can happen, but it doesn't play fast and loose with the truth, right? That's sort of a premise of journalism as a profession. And yet, we have these experiments with generative AI, especially in relation to journalism, where there's lots of mistakes that are being made. And these are just a few that I gathered, but there's, I won't go through them individually. I'll call out a couple of my favorites. One is a quote, an interview with Michael Schumacher, who famously does not give interviews at all. And a German magazine made up an interview with him, which is sort of like, if you're going to do that, what a bizarrely sort of thing to call attention to. And Schumacher's people were like, we don't do interviews. Those quotes are made up. And of course, they found out. This last one, Ars Technica reported, this was just last month, who covers AI errors, was found to have, and again, and I want to tell a little bit of this story because there's a human development to this. He was really sick, had the flu, was on deadline, he had a bunch of notes, he had done a lot of the reporting work, a lot of the legwork, had a bunch of notes, and he used ChatGPT to generate part of the story. ChatGPT made a mistake. It generated a quote that the person had not said who was interviewed with. The person had kept their own notes and their own recording of what the conversation was, and they were able to compare. The guy was called out, he resigned. It was a clear story. But the reason I want to say that is I also want to say this is an error for sure, but it's also a little bit of an error that's in the context of a profession that's being asked to produce content really quickly with few resources, with not a lot of pay. So I do not want to demonize at all journalists for doing this work. A lot of times these are the conditions, the economic conditions that they're working within. So in some ways, it's not surprising that that kind of error would grow out of those professional conditions. But we've got a bunch of other examples here. But the reason I say all this is that we're building to a different kind of public here. Some of these errors in journalism, there's a lot of them that are there. Actually, no, let me say one more because it's really great. Basically, never write a story about Star Wars and use AI. Your fan community will lose it on you, just lose it. So there's also some communities that are sort of more or less sensitive to these stories. A Gizmodo author found that out pretty quickly. But these errors, they come from a lot of different places that I would say are sort of baked into journalism as a profession. So sometimes it was an editorial misjudgment. An editor said, yeah, I shouldn't have done that. I cut a corner, didn't mean to do that. Sometimes it's this cost of experimentation, again, thinking about Neff's concept of permanently beta, this idea that we're just going to keep trying, it's going to get better eventually, don't expect news to be 100% accurate anymore while we're in this interregnum of experimenting with generative AI. I mentioned these labor and economic pressures. Sometimes it's unclear workflows where journalists are saying, I thought somebody else was going to check that, not me. And this is the messy work of sort of taking something from reporting to writing to publication, is sometimes it is unclear whether these are there. Sometimes these are these sort of audience expectations. Some journalists have said, audiences don't expect it to be that accurate all the time, so they're actually putting it on the audience as a problem. I could keep going, but to say, what's going on here in terms of the public? The public here, I think, and I'm very, very, very open to other interpretations, but it's an audience, it's autonomous, it's sort of making decisions for itself, it's reading, it's consuming texts, it expects these texts to be truth-telling, it expects the profession to be monitoring itself and self-correcting. But when you think about the public obligation of journalism as a profession, this publicness lives in the profession's ability to regulate itself, the profession's ability to observe itself, to know itself, to do what Don Schoen talks about being as a reflective practitioner, right? To be able to not only do your work, but be able to step outside of your work and ask, why did that happen? Why did something different happen? How could it have been otherwise, this workflow? But that's, I think, the kind of public that we've got going on here, is this public that is expecting something of journalism. It's not content, it's news. And those are two different words, and we should use them precisely and differently in different ways. Okay, that's my third one, but if I have, okay, I'm gonna take just a few minutes and introduce a fourth, and it's partly because I want help thinking this through. It's newer, maybe less formed work, but I think there's, especially this news language error, has got me thinking lately about other kinds of errors that are sort of lurking in relation to generative AI specifically. And I'd love to think about what kinds of those errors these are. Are they errors at all? And how might we go about them? So this is an example. This is kind of an older one for now, but it's one I use a lot in teaching, but it sticks with me. I don't know if people have seen this example before, but this is in the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina. So this is in Louisiana. These are two people. The top image was taken by Associated Press. The bottom image was taken by Agence France Presse. On the right is the description that went with, the top right is the description that went with the top left picture. This description goes with that photo on the left. Essentially here, the description that Associated Press made of the image in the top left was a young man walked through chest-deep flood waters, this is after Hurricane Katrina, after, quote, looting a grocery store in New Orleans on Tuesday. Okay, that's the description that's here. Bottom one, Agence France, 2 residents wade through chest-deep water after finding bread and soda from a local grocery store. It's not rocket science to say, I mean, there's a absolute race dynamic going on here, right? This is people of color loot, white people find. I'm not trying to overgeneralize in the way that I say that, but it's sort of it's within the space of what I think a lot of journalists would call, this is a, quote, reasonable caption. This is the type of caption that floats through, that slides by a lot in journalism. I don't think this word choice in the moment would have raised a bunch of flags the way that we can, especially when you juxtapose them, you sort of say, wait, there's something more going on there. But I want to say this is the type of use of language that's not, quote, erroneous in the same way those earlier factual statements were. This is not making up an interview with Michael Schumacher. There's something else going on here, and I kind of want to think about what that something else is. And I'll show you a few other examples. These are a little bit more, this is 2 days ago, 3 days ago. So I've highlighted the bits that I think are a little bit jaw-dropping about this language. This is the one in the top left-hand corner, sorry. The wife of LA Clippers owner and billionaire Steve Ballmer, so she doesn't get a name. She doesn't get to have a name. Steps in to help. But again, it's not a factual error to say that this is the wife of the person, but it's a choice that's made on how to do this phrasing. Here's one. Ocasio-Cortez offers a working-class vision in Munich with some stumbles. This is the quote that the New York Times had of AOC. Quote, I think that, so I'm reading right here. Quote, I think that this is such a, I think that this is of course a very long-standing policy of the United States. What's going on here? Sorry, this is not a classroom. I forgot, not doing call and response. I forgot for a second. Usually journalists do not quote speech like this.
They never quote Trump like that.
They never quote Trump like that. Good, thank you. Right, so there's something going on here. Again, not a factual error. I bet you if you had the tape, you could probably say, okay, she did speak like this, but that's a judgment. That's a judgment call that's being made. Trump expressed condolences for American troops, and yet the quote is, sadly, there will likely be more before it ends. That's the way it is, likely be more. I would say that's a curious use of the word condolences by the journalist. The Pentagon announces the first 3 American deaths in the war with Iran. It's not inaccurate to say those were the first, but what is the word first doing there in that sentence, right? It's pointing to something else that's to come. USAID is said to be keeping just 290 of its 10,000 employees. Again, what's the word just doing there? It's making a judgment about 290 of 10,000. Luckily, there are ways to think about this, and I draw upon the work here. Elizabeth Lepari is a wonderful feminist linguist who has what she calls stance words. And she specifically looks at stance words in relation to journalism and says, these stance words is how journalists routinely and regularly sneak in interpretation and judgment into this profession, which, as I said earlier, is supposedly, just about the facts. All this it's meant to be a factually based, truth-telling profession. Lepari says, no. If you pay attention, specifically adverbs. She looks at adverbs, right? So things that were done, quote, this is her words, obviously, clearly, apparently, presumably. This is the type of language that's probably not going to maybe cause a problem for a fact checker, but it's the type of language that is a type of journalistic power. It's a type of editorial power. It's a type of narrative power. This is the storytelling aspect of journalism. So here's what brings it to me, and then I'll wrap up. What brings this to me is, are these errors? If we just for a second say that this world of hallucinations, of news stories that have factual errors in them, we might say, it's going to get better. Those error rates are going to go down. Fast forward 3 years from now, I bet you, the LLMs will get better and there'll be fewer and fewer errors. So actually, it's not a good idea for us, especially as scholars, to focus our inquiry on those types of errors because they might go away, or they're not necessarily doing the explanatory work that we want them to do. But there's a different kind of thing here that I think is messier. I think it's squishier, and I think it's an institutional phenomenon. This is not simply just a technical error rate problem. This is about how the institution of journalism works. The last bit they'll tell for this story is Michael Judson, who many of you know in the room, but has this idea of, instead of talking about journalism's objectivity, what actually in practice a lot of journalists do is talk about their mature subjectivity. So journalists, they know the difference between facts and values, and they know how to use those words differently, and they do that with professional judgment. They do that with experience and judgment. And that's a power. That's a power of good journalism, is deploying this mature subjectivity. So how does this mature subjectivity exist in synthetic news systems? If journalism, I would call it a stance profession, right? It's a profession that's meant to have a stance. It's meant to have a stance that's grounded in something. It's meant to be good argumentation. It's meant to have a reason for there. But are these maybe stance errors? Are these errors that can be engaged with in a different kind of way than a factual error? And then I'll truly stop in a second to wrap up. But I think this is the bit that I guess is most interesting to me right now, is I think this is the space of sort of interpretation, of maybe hermeneutics, of sort of ways of thinking about what language and communication are doing in relation to generative AI and synthetic texts. That's not only just about checking an error rate or punishing a journalist who got something wrong. It's situating these technologies within institutions that have norms and traditions and genealogies and ways of making claims about the world. There's something different about this space of error, and I don't yet know how to think about it, but this is where I'm sort of trying to think about a little bit here. Okay, to wrap up. What I've tried to do here is a little bit draw on, again, these sort of STS notions of how technologies stabilize or change, long-standing work thinking about when new technologies are introduced or sort of gain public visibility. There's this moment of interpretive flexibility where there's a lot of competing interest groups will sort of try to describe the significance or the dynamics of a technology. Those competing groups fight it out in various ways. Eventually there's something sort of like a closure, but these sort of descriptions become narrower and narrower. It's not to say resistance isn't possible, but it's sort of a different type of stabilization. I think that's kind of what we're in right now a little, maybe for not too much longer, but we're in this moment where errors can be a way to keep alive that flexibility. If we can see errors in as many ways as possible and see their dynamism as much as possible and see them as coming from many different types of forces, maybe it's a way to keep this thing alive and flexible that a lot of other forces are trying to collapse and say, just use it. right? Just use it in your classroom, just use it in wherever it is you are, but just collapsing it. So keeping an eye out for those errors is a way to keep that flexibility. So I want just to end, I'll come back to this idea. What I tried to say is that we've got accounts of failures, can show us ideals of publics, and we could also have ideals of publics that may show us particular types of failures. This is my political theory geek slide a little bit here, but there's lots of, Slavoj Špikl is a really wonderful scholar who talks, he kind of gets cranky if you ask him too much about it, but there's sort of a cottage industry of people who put adjectives in front of the word public. And like if you want to get a paper published, invent a new public, right? It's sort of like, I'm guilty of this myself. I've written things where I'm like, it's a blank public, and there's a thing. No shortage of publics, lots of different kinds of publics. But the reason I want to keep alive these adjectives of publics a little bit is maybe these are ways to think about different types of failure or different places to go look for those publics. So if you're in a, maybe a Chris Ledontic world where you're interested in infrastructural publics, maybe you'll go look in machine learning data sets, models, interfaces. If you're in a Chris Kelty, like recursive public, the power of the public to create itself, to sort of know the conditions under which the public forms. Maybe you could look at how maker communities work. If you're in a Tarleton Gillespie sort of algorithmic public world, you're thinking about the probabilities, the thresholds of publics, or of machine learning. If you're in a Henry Jenkins, maybe participatory public world, then you're interested in how communities define for themselves, perhaps, those things. And this is the last bit. I've been sort of going back to Warner's thinking about textual publics and counter publics. Maybe this thing I was talking about of stance errors, where we're really trying to focus on the text. We're trying to think about where the text comes from, what the text does. Maybe we need to go back and look at some of these textual publics and counter publics that Warner talked to us about. Okay, truly last bit I'll say is, for me, the other bit I come back to is what I find tricky about generative AI, and I don't know how to resolve, and I don't want to resolve in a way, but it has this both ontological and epistemological sort of tension to it. It's a thing. It's a thing that might need to be regulated, that might need to be used or not used, resisted, not resisted, whatever. But increasingly, it's also this agent. There's sort of it's with us in some of these things. I don't think I have it turned on. I hope I don't on this right now. But some of you may be with us right now, generating a summary of this talk. Maybe it might be there, but it's with it. It's an agent and it's an object at the same time. So that's for me sort of the thing when we think about publics. We're not in the world of channels. We're not thinking about messages that go through channels to convene publics, nor are we really in the world of, I would say, infrastructural publics, which was a different phase as well. I think we're in this world where there's a thing that's simultaneously an object to be concerned about, but it's also an agent, a thing that's with us that might be doing some of the concerning as well. And that's for me, the messiness that I'm trying to make sense of. Okay, I truly will stop. These are some things I've been writing about on this, but I'll stop there and have some tea. Thank you.
It'll capture. Yeah.
It'll capture. I can repeat stuff. Yeah. Oh, sure. Yeah. I'm happy if anybody has questions, comments, or anything. I didn't cough the whole time, too. That was exciting. Okay, yes. Hi, sorry.
Speak to the Florida shooting. Are you familiar with that?
I'm sad to say I have to ask which one are we talking about?
The one where ChatGPT is being
Oh,
responsible.
Yeah. So I'll confess I'm less familiar with that one, but my understanding is that it's so there's a case in Canada that I'm more familiar. Okay, yeah, okay. The Canadian one, I think they're probably the same, but if people know both, correct me if I'm wrong. But so the Canadian one, Tumbler Ridge, was the community in Canada where the person who did the shooting was sort of, I want to use words carefully here, but was in a quote conversation with ChatGPT where there was ideation of doing this act. There was talking about the logistics of doing this act, of this school shooting. There was, what you might call encouragement to do the act. There were a lot of interactions with ChatGPT that the person who did the shooting had. OpenAI later said that that person's use of ChatGPT had not risen to a threshold to be something that they would report to law enforcement automatically. So the person's use of ChatGPT got through, they committed the act, and after the fact, there was sort of, again, in Canada, we're most familiar with this, a really big public outcry to say these are dangerous products that are causing harm, that are not well regulated, and then specifically in a Canadian context, it's beholden to American notions of what constitutes harm or threat or imminent harm. So there was also a sovereignty issue that was happening there.
In this context.
Yeah, in this context, thank you. In this context, I mean, I guess I would say I would want to try to see how that would be constructed as a public problem. The competing things I think at play there are keywords like harm, like likelihood. There's also, with Meg and Finn, I've done some work on, again, anticipatory publics. So we've talked about publics as the things that don't exist, but they might exist. So sort of thinking about anticipate. To me, I would think about that as a kind of anticipatory public where it's the tricky bit there too is to say there's real free speech issues to be concerned about, because if you, it's sort of, this is not a sophisticated analysis, but if you set that threshold too low and you say anybody who's, and linearity isn't even really a thing, so low high doesn't make sense, but if you set it very low, then somebody who's researching something, trying to find out something, trying to use language in a way that might seem imminently, harmful in some way, then I think you could have a chilling effect on speech. So that might be, the problem might be set too low. I'm sorry, this is not a strong answer to your question, but I would think about maybe decomposing that type of incident and say, can I describe it in other allied words like risk, anticipation, harm, likelihood, and is there an intervention that might be made at a different point along the way? But can I ask you, sorry, given that was a weak answer, can I ask you, what is your, do you have a relationship to it or a thought about it?
My biggest concern is harm.
Yeah,
Right?
yeah.
Because there is a duty, we have a duty to prevent harm,
Mm-hmm.
all of us, when it's within our power.
Yeah,
And so from my perspective, that's the biggest scare
Sure.
out of these two, and Florida is very much like that.
is it? Okay, I wasn't familiar enough with it. Yeah, so I totally agree. I guess partly what's in my brain as well, which is maybe causing a slow response on this is this is the history of user-generated content and policy regulation that we've had this conversation on social media for a very long time now about blocking particular words or blocking access, and also thinking about, I have a really wonderful student, Qian Zhang, who's doing her dissertation on harm in the child and sort of historicizing how technologies have constructed the idea of the child and constructed the idea of harm. And there's a long, really fraught, problematic history of, for some young people, if you're searching for terms related to queer identity, that's harmful in some, they would say that's harmful, so they would get blocked or flagged. And I think you would have a different normativity maybe that would say, no, that's not about harm at all, that's something else. So we've had these debates, and mostly in relation to the ChatGPT, the Tumbler Ridge one, I was a little shocked at how isolated that discussion seemed to be from these long-standing discussions of user-generated content and social media regulation of how, because we've sort of, I think in spirit, we've done this before. We've had this conversation about the balance between harm and expression and algorithmic anticipation. Sorry, I'm going to keep thinking about it, so thank you though. I really appreciate the prompt. You can, hey. Hi.
This is very thoughtful talk. I wanted to go back to the first instance of the charismatic sense.
Okay.
It's something I've been thinking a lot about and attended a lot of talks with those charismatic individuals too.
Mm-hmm. Me too.
Like the
Yeah.
component of the public debate and your thoughts of it too, kind of creating a spectrum, sometimes almost binary in these. I know that you look at these letters, but just thinking about its impact, of course, also on journalistic kind of like narratives about it. If there's any kind of thought on that, in that domain of what kind of public debate around the kind of errors, issues, and AI-dominated publics face these charismatic individuals and their hyper kind of representation creates for our understanding of how we should approach these issues as it relates to AI?
Yeah, that's such a great question, and I'm near and dear to some of those figures and moments as well. So I think so. There's a few things I think that are happening. One is that sometimes this is sort of the people and the events and the flashpoints of a letter, a boycott, or something like that's kind of catnip to journalists sometimes, right? Because it's a way to take long-standing structural, like if you're ever talking to a journalist and they say, what's your opinion on it? You say, well, it's a structural inequality, and their eyes glaze over and they're like, I'm not talking to you about structural historical forces. They're like, give me a thing, I want to think. So I think in some ways it's a quote good PR tactic, right? So if you have an investment in something, of course you create this kind of event, you create this kind of conflict, you create this kind of moment. So I think there's a little bit of these charismatic figures helping out journalists and journalists helping out charismatic figures. So and that's not a new story. That's like that's the PR industry, right? That's agents, and the history of public relations as a field has always kind of done that. Where I do think, and this is really speculative on my part, but I know there's a couple people, and I think I'll not name them for proximity reasons, but talking about, no, not in the room, at the university, not in the room. Talking about the con of AI, but also the, I'm forgetting the word for a second. It's like it's basically ridicule and shame, and saying that what we have to do as critics of tech, we have to shame and ridicule the charismatic figures who are pro-tech. So you have to, because there's a longer sort of cultural phenomenon where like shame seems to have gone away in this country, right? There's like people do things that Gary Hart's presidential campaign ended because he was found on a boat with somebody who wasn't his wife. Career over. Howard Dean, screams into a poorly paced microphone. Career over. Like these kinds of moments in this country that used to like end careers happen almost every day now, and this idea of shame or ridicule isn't a factor. And yet I see these charismatic figures, what I think is curious, they seem to be invested in individualistic or sort of solipsistic sort of ways of framing the problem. They're sort of like, we got to shame them into good behavior. And I'm like, well, maybe that's because you're also in this industry where you're like about shame, embarrassment, coming back. Like that's a very individualistic way to think about the call and response of problem making. So that's, and again, that's speculative, and I don't think I have a really strongly analytical way to think about that, but it seems like a set of people who like these personal fights. And I don't think that's not a way to do public problem making, I think. Specifically because it's about shared consequences, right? Go back to Dewey. It's not about fame fighting. It's about shared consequence fighting. Yeah.
Hi, Phil Gruner. I'm a political economist in the business school.
Nice.
Fascinating talk. This is great. Thank you. Have you done a sort of actual analysis just to see in the popular discourse or in popular media if journalists who are reporting on AI are using the term mistake as frequently as they use the term error? Are you seeing that on?
I do not have data to speak to that, so no, I don't have it. But can I just ask, what's your intuition there?
Well, computer programmers will use the term error when
Yeah.
the code fails.
Yeah.
And so you would expect a computer programmer or a tech CEO who works well with computer programmers to say that if a model doesn't produce the result as designed,
Right.
the predictive text fails.
Yeah.
There's an error in the code.
Yeah.
A mistake, of course, is something that humans
Yeah.
do.
Yeah.
So I'm just curious to know because it seems you might be equivocating errors with mistakes, and I'm just wondering if you're actually seeing in either popular journalism or in the responses of tech leaders to questions about model integrity, if they are saying
Yeah.
that these models are
Yeah.
making mistakes. Because mistake, of course, implies agency on par with a human agent.
I love the question, and I haven't done a discourse analysis, so I can't speak to the frequency of those terms or who's using them in any kind of way. But I do agree. I think the phenomenon that you're pointing to, I do see that happening a lot, and this is just anecdotal, I'll say, but is people with sort of training as computer scientists who would say, my undergrad was in computer science. I'm a terrible coder. I do not make systems in any robust kind of way. But I remember, talking about the difference between, compile time errors and runtime errors, and right, that's a moment where, compiling it, there's going to show off one kind of error versus you put it in front of a user and there's like a runtime error when someone's doing it. I had a professor once, I remember, who I have written a little bit about this. He said, do you know where most of the bugs are in a computer system? It's between the chair and the keyboard. And he said this to our computer science class, and everybody laughed, and I was like, how? Because what's between the chair and the keyboard is the human. And the humans are these bug-ridden things that mess up good systems, right? That was his joking claim. But I do think you're right that there's an intuition to say, depending on your relationship to what these systems are, you're going to use different language to think about what the failure, the breakdown, or the unexpected outcome, where it came from, also why it matters, who might be responsible for it. So I think the difference in language is really key there. And the last bit I'll say is I remember when algorithms were first like a hot topic, right? There was I was at Microsoft Research at the time, and I had a lot of colleagues there. And a lot of the computer scientists were sort of like, why are you all so interested in algorithms as a word? They're not interesting as a thing. And all the social science people were like, are you kidding? It's the next big, whatever, it's a thing. But so algorithm became that word that was doing a lot of different kinds of work. So that's what I would look to is mistake, error, breakdown is maybe doing a little bit of what algorithm was doing as well. It's showing these different views. Yeah. Oh, yeah, David.
Thank you for a great talk. First, it's really nice to hear you did make it about AI. AI is something happening in AI, but also you're giving us something wider too. At the same time, that we can think through other things. So I really appreciate that. It's really nice.
Thanks.
I'm still going to ask you a hard question.
Sure, that's fine. I expected it.
So if the model is public's problems serve as spaces to articulate public service spaces to articulate these publics are about articulating our ideals and so on. Yes. But I started getting nervous when you started saying maybe you like these people or maybe you don't like these people, and then you were sort of also saying there's this problem and that problem, and I started worrying that there's a whole threshold of things that I suspect that never make their way into this public sphere, problem discussion, and then we could be it almost sounds like you're saying all the problems come up and get bubbled and we work our things out. But I sort of suspect that there's systematically some problems that never make it to this stage.
Oh yeah,
that, it probably does matter who are these charismatic figures and what interests they have and which problems do they bring forth.
Sure.
And which ones do they make charismatic through their charisma, and which ones are being cast essentially as not problems or below the threshold of problem or don't make it into this public discourse. You see what
yeah, no, totally. I sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you. I 100% agree, and I may have been a little fast and loose in how I was talking about the various people. I'll also say bluntly, these are people I know a lot of. And it's sometimes a little. I'm doing a little bit of a double work sometimes to say I know you, I hang out with you, but also you're a thing. You're also circulating in the world in a way. So I that's if my language has a discomfort to it, I think that's part of it. No, absolutely. So there's a whole world of sort of celebrity studies that would also tell us that the kinds of people who get to be, and these are kinds of celebrities in a way, the people who are there. The kinds of people get to be celebrities. The route to being a celebrity can have different things. Sometimes it might be sort of an artistic ability. Sometimes it might be you found yourself a part of an event that that you didn't necessarily mean to be, but you gain a visibility. So there's a whole, John Durham Peters has written about this, of publics as products of visibility. And you can have a whole discussion about publics through the lens of what is visible, full stop. It's not about normative investment, it's not about deliberation, it's not about material relations, it's not about participation, it's just these cultures of visibility have their own logics to them that are, have histories and all those kinds of things. So I think a lot of the people that I mentioned and that I have in mind, and there's people not on that slide that could be on that slide, do visibility. They do visibility in a successful way. And I think, and when I've honestly talked to some of them will sort of openly say, again, in a celebrity-like way, I'm using my visibility because I think this form of power has to be challenged, and I know what I'm doing. I'm not naive to what this is, nor do I think that I'm like a regular professor the way other professors are. Like they know the difference between it. Again, that's fine, but I put that in the sort of a celebrity, and I sometimes use the word like fiduciary model of like they're taking care of us. Their celebrity is taking care of us, and if that benevolence works for a political investment or normativity, great, in a sense that there's an advancement of that, but I 100% agree, there's a space not covered by that don't have celebrities, that don't have sort of advocates, that don't have benevolence to do that for us. And that's absolutely there. So I don't want to say more about that, but I think I would almost like, who are the not celebrities who are not there? Sorry, I saw both of your hands at once, and I can't tell who's.
I was interested that a lot of the conversations that I hear around AI are less about errors that AI makes, but the problems that people using it, right? Especially around students, right? It's making
Sure.
Conversation, making students do this.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering, do you see that kind of conversation as falling under one of these umbrellas, or is that conversation creating a different notion of a public?
Yeah. Oh, thank you. That's such a great question. So there's a different talk that I give, and I'm not sure I'm going to be able to. Well, let me try real fast to do it. So there's a different talk I give where. So when USC went online, we were asked to use Respondus Monitor, which is this face detection system, so that the students taking exams, you probably know what I'm talking about, right? So they would like place the face, right? So like most universities, we rolled this out lots. I don't know if you dubbed it or not, but probably some version similar to it to like, create, to minimize academic violations, people cheating. Basically, they're worried that people going home and cheating during COVID. Turns out Respondus Monitor had a much higher error rate for students of color because they were losing students of color, the face could not be detected. And it was a couple things. One was the data sets, the models were trained on white faces. So it kept having a higher error rate for students of color. I was part of a task force. We were asked to identify what kind of problem is this? And I was like, oh, this is like both awful and tragic, and also like this is exactly what we're called upon in these moments of getting to do it. And we had a big fight on this task force to say what kind of problem was this. And I advocated for saying, well, this is an economics problem in this. Like, why are we using these standardized measures at all? It's definitely a race problem. It's definitely a technology problem, as we waited for a vendor to give us a fix that they said would come soon. The vendor's solution to the problem, and this blows my mind, if people know Simone Brown and the lamplighting laws in New York, and this I'm seeing some head nods. So there was a law in New York, and I think it was the 1700s, I could be wrong, but essentially people of color living in New York had to, by law, carry lamps with them to illuminate their own faces to be observable by law enforcement after dark, because the idea was that people of color had to make themselves visible to law enforcement. The vendor told us, what you should do is get your students of color to have Ring cameras that are facing directly on them to make their skin as light as possible, and then our system won't fail as much. That was the quote solution that was ready. That was a space of, that was a weird time for a lot of reasons, but that was like, there were lots of definitions of this problem and circulations floating around. Our provost eventually decided to do a very mild version of, we weren't gonna use that feature of the software, but we never got into, I would say, and this is maybe to David's point as well, there were so many other ways of describing that problem. Because it's like, why do the economics of the university require classes that need 300 people and thus need standardized testing? Because we can't scale, we can't have a scale of university learning that would support not using facial detection systems. We can't address the economic and race and social inequalities of our students. We're supposed to put it back on them. That for me was, I absolutely see these struggles for problem definitions everywhere. And this is, again, not rocket science to say, but often what happened is what happened in that story, which is putting it back on the individual to say, light your face up, or keep track of the essay drafts that you did and hand in, like, you as student have to show me what I need to know so that I don't think you've cheated on something. And I understand there's lots of variations of ways to do that, but I do think that's a common pattern in these socio-technical problem moments is it's easier to put it on the individual, it's easier to do all those kinds of things than it is to ask the other questions. Sorry, that was again a divergence, but I still have that with me. Like, I can't believe, that was a provost task force meant to think about it, and we missed a chance to ask really hard questions about what the heck a university is. We didn't do that work. We didn't make that problem be a good problem in a way. Sorry, yes, you had your hand up. Yeah, hi.
Thanks, Professor. I think you offered a great framework for understanding different kinds of topics. I'm curious about how did you come up with the formation of the charismatic topics, for example, putting Bill Gates and Sam Altman in the same slide with Tim Gibru or Emily Bender, because clearly they have big gender and class difference, sometimes race difference as a material problem that is not subject of interpretation or framing, but they're materially different in terms of class ability to make their voice heard. So I wonder if it is fair to put them in the same kind of charismatic category, even though their publics are very different, especially the billionaire class versus the academic critics, who doesn't get to rise to the level of celebrity unless they really do a substantial amount of work. And also in the maker category, you pointed out journalists as a part of also the coders, people who are behind detecting errors. But if there is also another way, like class and, or if you could put W.B. Du Bois's global color line framework there, that there are people who cleaned up that data for $2 a day, but didn't make it to the category that you're putting forward to us to think about publics. So are there categories such as subaltern publics within your charismatic or maker publics? Consider those intersectional angles.
Yeah, no, thank you very much. And just there's a lot of work that doesn't make it in there. There's a paper I can send you that does get at this, but Sarah Jackson and Dan Crease's work, drawing upon Catherine Squire's work of enclave publics and satellite publics, as well as another thing that gets discussed in here that absolutely has a race, a socioeconomic, and a gender dynamic to it, to thinking about it. Because you're 100% correct, and there's different types of power that are circulating. And by putting all these people on one slide, I don't mean to equate their positionality in any way, and that's not the intention at all. I will, with that said though, I will say that the people who enter into that space with the kind of visibility that a lot of these people have, they are having very visible, to the point earlier about visible publics, they're having visible contestations and fights with each other in very high profile sort of media environments. So a lot of these are, I didn't have it, but that's Timid in the New York Times, this is Rolling Stone, these are not small places where this is happening. And that's all that, in terms of making the public's argument, is meant to say these are charismatic moments, not to ignore or erase any of the structural inequalities that brought different people to these different places. And of course, the tech CEOs and billionaires, they tend to be largely white men from privileged backgrounds who, famously dropped out of school. And there's a whole narrative about the genius, white male tech Silicon Valley figure. That is all absolutely part of the story. So no, I don't mean to equate this, but what I do want to hold on to here is who the public gets to be if this is the fight that's being had in these kinds of places. And it's that, and I do think that that's analytically about what a public is. That's a way of seeing the public that doesn't have to be orthogonal to or separate from the structural inequality question. The second question that you had about the sort of the dynamics. So in journalism studies, we absolutely see, well, there's two bits in what you asked, the second bit. One is the media labor to clean data, train systems, and that is absolutely largely happening in global South contexts. Interestingly, this country, so I did a project with Jake Carr where we looked at media unions framing of who gets to count as a media worker and is deserving protection. I will say the people that we're talking about in terms of global South folks who are cleaning data, gathering data, training models, US media unions have largely cut those people out. And when we've talked to them and we've looked at their materials, they draw a bright line and say, that's not who we mean by media worker. That's unionization within this country, which we can sort of mark and celebrate in lots of different ways, but they're drawing a bright line to say, those people are not part of who we consider a solidarity movement of media labor. That was notable to me where I say, okay, that's a cleaving of what kinds of labor gets to count for collective bargaining agreements in this country, but that's secondary. The other part of what you're asking though is about, we do see a lot of absolutely structural inequalities in terms of who is either expected to, allowed to, or gets blamed for using synthetic media tools in journalism contexts. And one of the big ones there is career stage. So there's a lot of people in news organizations, again, mostly older white male, who are able to insulate themselves from this phenomenon. A lot of people I've interviewed who said, I don't use generative AI, I don't have to. I do what I've always done. And they're in some ways, quote, fine, and they're gonna retire. And like, it's the younger people, again, who are paid far less well, who are often people of color and women who are sort of looking for a first entry job into this world. Their struggle with how to either use generative AI or avoid it or ask critical questions within their organizations, they're often at a much lower power position to be able to ask critical questions of how the technology should or should not be used within it. And so that's in terms of the structural inequality I see within newsrooms, is we see more of a career stage one that absolutely maps onto and mirrors a lot of gender and race dynamics. And it's playing out in generative AI debates. But thank you for that. Appreciate it. Sorry, yeah, I'm gonna. Adrian, you cut it off whenever you. Okay. Hi.
Thank you so much for this talk. I really find the idea that kind of like AI errors can be a way to keep alive introverted flexibility. Kind of like brings back some optimism into some of the doom and gloom. So I really like that idea, and I guess I was curious, just thinking about breakdown and going back to especially some of these examples and like the charismatic like embraces and refusals. I almost wondered if potentially some of these examples are more so like refuting breakdown entirely, especially when you think of the really extreme ends of either kind of AI refusal where people are saying it's not about these like errors in generative AI, it's really about the whole entire like history of the internet and all the structural inequality that goes back to like where this data is coming from and everything reaching back there. And then kind of on the flip side, you have, I guess, existential risk people where they're not so much viewing AI as flawed because they're saying, oh, like this artificial general intelligence is this like perfect flawless thing that will come and kind of like sweep out humanity. And I think on both ends of those, I almost feel like, yeah, the breakdown is being a kind of like refuted almost in two very different ways. And I guess I was just curious, like, do you think, is that the way you see it? Like with, refuting breakdown in those areas, and also like, how does that kind of impact the role of like these publics and to what extent AI is a public problem in these discourses?
Yeah, thank you for that. I think so in my reading, I've read a lot of I've read more than maybe I want to, like profiles of charismatic figures and letters they've written, and there's long profiles and books they've written from a first-person perspective. I think I'm not sure if I would do this as a next piece of work, but I would love somebody to do is, I think the category of charismatic figure is obviously too broad to capture the variances and the differences that you're describing. Because I think there are some people who, own their charisma and own their visibility. There's some people who actually, I think, have less self-awareness of that. There's some people who see the object that they're in relation to as whether it's AGI or whether it's AI or generative AI, and they have different sort of implied things that they're either celebrating or fighting with. I think there are also some people who are sort of making compromises more from a very understandable sort of activist perspective of saying, of course I know it's more complicated than that. Of course I know that, this treatment deserves more than a quick PR campaign that's good. Like, it's not lost on these very, very smart people, but they're sort of making a choice about how to relate to the phenomenon. So what I think I would love to do, or somebody else to do maybe as a next step, is to sort of try to use that collection of figures. Like if that passes the test to say this collection of people in some way is hanging together as a set of people who are fighting with each other in this moment, and you could empirically create a basis for that, then what variation do we see amongst those people, whether it's timelines they're working on, kinds of self-awareness, kinds of language to the person who was just left who was here, but types of language they're using. When some people are using error, they actually mean mistake, vice versa. I think there's a lot of precision that could be brought to that I don't think I'm bringing in this cursory sort of quick treatment. And then the last thing I'll say on that, though, is that might teach us something about a much more precise way of thinking about charismatic publics. Like go back to the construction of publics. If we can get the precision that I think you're asking for in your question, that might tell us something deeper about how these publics work. But I haven't done that work, but I think that would be great work for someone to do. Yeah. Mako, sorry, I saw both your hands at basically the same time.
Okay, so we have the public problem of AI and the things.
Okay.
But like in problem number 4.
Yeah, okay.
Problem number 4, you seem very cautious not to use a couple words. One would be content.
Okay, yeah.
One would be audience.
Yeah.
Like there's this production of content and there's an audience.
Mm-hmm.
What do you see as the relationship of audience?
Oh, audience to public?
Okay.
Oh my goodness, this is like a quals question. Yeah. This is like a quals question. I do tend to use the word public. I mean, again, I think they're doing different things. So and mostly this is a little bit of angels on the head of a pin. There's literature on audiences, which would talk about sort of passive audiences, active audiences, interpretive audiences, participatory audiences. But these are people who are involved in sort of largely either making sense of or making or convening around media representations, and in a media sense where we might, again, I'm collapsing a lot, but messages, pictures, texts, audio, video, all those kinds of things. Totally fine. If you a more sort of pragmatist Deweyan notion of publics thinks about publics as things that are brought into being through relationships that that communication creates. So Dewey would say communication makes publics because there's no such thing as a public issue that we just go find out in the world. We talk to each other, and then if you take a Latourian sort of more actor network-ish type thing, the objects, the actants involved in that conversation about what gets to count as a shared concern. So Dewey would talk about a shared concern that you cannot extract yourself from, no matter how much money you have, no matter whether you're interested or not, whatever. If an earthquake hits right now, it doesn't matter if you're interested in the earthquake, you are part of the earthquake. Like, it's just, that's what it is. So that would be sort of a material public moment. that can exist whether we've told a story about the earthquake, whether there's a recording of the earthquake, whether like that's still happening. That's still happening to us. So I think when I think about publics and problems, I'm more interested in this. I'm also relying on people like Noor Chamaris, who's a student of Latour, but people who think about the worlds that are getting created at this intersection of people and materials and media that is behaving like materials. It's setting conditions, it's sort of creating relationships, it's signaling what's a norm or not a norm, it's playing a part in this collision of meaning making that we're doing as we decide whether something is a public issue worthy of attention or not. And that's separate from even the state. Like the state, again, would be something different. The state is gonna, Dewey would say the state cares for public interests. If you don't have a public interest, the state shouldn't be involved. That would be a strict Deweyan kind of thing. But so there's different flavors of all of these things, and they obviously overlap, and I don't mean to be strident in one versus the other, but I think there's some precision about what we're talking about when. Yeah.
Okay, I have I'm not sure, this is great. I loved it. I love the conversations about errors. Many, many years ago, I did some book on errors as well.
Oh, I didn't know that. Okay.
Please
send it.
You'll get a hint of where I'm, maybe we should talk about it. But
Okay,
later.
okay.
Your framing about errors is mostly about the limits and problems of the technology and about how the errors reveal the way in which that technology is not working at all. But actually, even many of your examples, like if you show the examples of the headlines, right? Like the Ars Technica one, for example, right? That's the one that I knew about, right?
Yeah.
At least some of these errors are what they revealed was the problem was not that like, oh yeah, the AI hallucinated and did that thing. That actually is what revealed the fact that the story had been written with AI at all.
Mm-hmm.
So what was being revealed was actually the presence of the technology in the context where we didn't realize it existed, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's the Ars Technica example, right?
Yeah.
They had been passed off as having been human created, when in fact it was AI created. And the reason we knew about it was the error, right?
Sure,
And so
yeah.
to me at least, and so this is getting at your anecdote about there's a strong parallel to the anecdote that you gave about the facial recognition thing, right?
Okay.
I've always found a lot of these conversations about like, these are of course, like, there's this long history of face recognition software working less well for people with darker skin tones.
Sure, yeah, no, I know, I know.
And I've always found this critique to be like a little bit funny because of course, like, facial recognition systems are mostly developed and used in the context of things like surveillance systems, right?
Yeah.
And the idea, like the police example, that like the problem with the facial recognition system is not, to me at least, and this is my own politics and feelings, is not the fact that the facial recognition system doesn't work equally well on people. And the fact that it doesn't work, like, the problem is that it's there at all.
Yeah.
That it's being used to do this, right? And so I think that.
Well, so let me interrupt just briefly to say, I mean, some of the people that I talked about there, like the early discourses around bias, about de-biasing data sets, were about making these biases data sets more inclusive. And like the gender shades papers really, it was in service of that. I mean, that was meant to be, these data sets that were treating people of color differently were evidence of structural biases. And the solutions that were called for. So I know I'm 100% with you on that. I think we keep seeing it for sure.
But is the solution to build better data sets for these systems?
No, I mean,
not build them at all.
Sure, yeah, no. So I'm absolutely, and if I gave any impression otherwise, no, I would be in the strong perspective of what are these systems doing? What role are they playing? And also I would put an institutionalist hat on and sort of say, well, they're coming from different places. They don't exist within any one place either, right? They're always this amalgam. What Woody Powell called loosely coupled arrays of standardized elements, right? That's what neo-institutionalism is sort of saying it's a shifting array of constantly elements that are there. So no, I'm sure, absolutely. But that's what, when I said, the Ars Technica, I told the story about the guy was not feeling well, but he was still under the pressure to write this story, right? There's another story I tell about how United Airlines stock price dropped because a poor Bloomberg stringer was expected to write a bunch of stories, used Google incorrectly, did it. I mean, if you scratch these stories, they're usually about economics, about power, about race, about gender, about geography, they're usually about those things. So no, 100%, we can make problems into different types of things. That's a question of public making, of problem making. That's there. Sorry, yeah.
Yeah, so I guess the comment is that I think that, and maybe this is is that, and I think that the errors in the systems will and are being fixed already. Like contemporary models lose it a lot less than they did before. There are structural approaches to do these sorts of things, right?
Sure.
But what's not like in some ways, there's this Mark Weiser sort of describes eyeglasses being perfect technology because you don't see them, you just see the world more clearly.
I remember
right?
is UBComp.
Yeah, this is the UBComp.
I know the Scientific American paper, that UBComp paper was like really, but that was not good.
Touch your glasses.
Yeah.
And all of a sudden, when your glasses have a crack or a smudge, you don't see anything but the glasses, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so that's an example of how errors reveal not just the problems of the technology, although potentially they also reveal the structures and the limits of the technology, right? But they actually reveal the existence of the technology. And for me, the problem is not that AI is not the biggest problem is that despite everyone always seems 70% of papers being about AI, I think there's a sense in which it's all the places in which it's being used we don't know about it or we're not hearing about it that are at least as important, because that's actually, and I think that's going to be increasingly the case, right?
Yeah,
in terms of mediation, in terms of where did this fact come from? Which kinds of things were not in the database?
No, and that's why I opened by saying you have to have an answer to what is this a case of. And if you don't have an answer to what is it a case of, then you need to think more, I think. I think we're agreeing. Yeah, I think we're agreeing.
Can I
Yeah.
One quick question.
Yeah.
Will you go to number 4?
Oh my goodness. Okay.
About stance error.
Oh yeah.
So it seems like you were asking a question, but you also have a theory that fits into the sort of tension between if you think of a profession being a technology revealing the stance error of humans in journalism, and how does that compare to the errors that we're seeing in AI, and what's your theory?
So the way I honestly I've been struggling with just how to study this in a way, because I don't actually know necessarily. One thought is I've been trying to think about trying to talk to, so I've observed journalists using generative AI a fair bit. I do this sort of work shadow thing where I just sort of watch what they do. Some of them will let me do it and some of them get creeped out and won't let me do it. But there's a lot of accepting, suggested words along the way. And I think probably if most of us were honest, we've done that as well in using tools where the gray word is there and you're like, that's not a bad word, tab, I'll take it. And they go, so journalists do that all the time, right? With this stance error lens, I wonder, a journalist who knows about stance error, because most journalists I don't think about this at all. The idea of a stance adverb and Elizabeth Lepari and feminists, not part of what they think about in daily life. Would they potentially relate to these systems differently if they had in mind that there's this thing called a stance error? And are they on guard for that? Because they're definitely on guard for factual errors. They're my fact checker's going to do it, the quote. There's a type of error that really, I don't think they have this kind of error in mind. So this is why I get to the struggle of how to study it, because in a way, all I'm studying is I would like to know, maybe it's a strategies question that I'm asking. Is it something how to communicate to them that there is a thing called the stance error? I'm actually not entirely sure what the intervention would be. Another intervention though might be to say, and again, I'm not sure I really want to do this, but there's groups like the News Product Alliance group, which builds data sets and large language models for journalists to use that are based on there's a thing called the audience data commons. So they're taking comments from audiences at small newsrooms around the country, and they're building their own data sets of audience comments. It's meant to be a pushback on whatever, right? Could there be sort of a stance error perspective that would go into a making culture where if you talk to maker culture and said maybe you should be aware of that, that's another thing. It also might be an audience kind of perspective where it's if you're encountering synthetically generated news, maybe there are, I don't know if there's more stance errors. I'm not even thrilled about the more or less than, but like, I don't know. It's not I don't know exactly what to do with it yet, but it's.
Show journalists that they have them, like by pointing them out. In
Yeah, yeah. So like most journalists would look at these, and when I've talked to journalists about these things, usually they just have almost like quasi-defensive reactions to the use of this language. And I'm like, you gotta use language. I'm not telling you don't use language, but do you know, anyway, there's so many different examples that I could have chosen to do this here. But yeah, I guess I would say, as journalists, their work is getting sped up, more infused with generative AI. My hypothesis, I guess, would be to say, I think journalists will have less room to be able to pay attention to stance errors, because I think they're going to be under even more pressure to not be able to pay attention to this kind of stuff.
One of the problems,
Yeah.
though, is that these errors will get replicated
Yeah,
by
sure.
AI because of its training data.
Yeah.
And that's unconscious bias. The wife of and the condolences.
Oh yeah, sure. Yeah. No, there's a whole bunch of different errors. Sure. Yeah. Please. Yeah.
You asked us like what you said it was like you were developing. This case felt really different from the first three.
Yeah.
Primarily because the first three you had been relying on sort of like other actors who were problematizing. You were tracking them, right?
Yeah.
But this one, it was you.
Yeah.
All of a sudden, it was you calling it out. And
Yeah.
so that changed the game quite a bit.
Yeah. No, I agree. I totally agree. And I don't know methodologically is the right word, but I'm not exactly sure what to do with that. So that's why I say it's very speculative. I'm sitting with this of like, I think there's a thing, but I don't know what to do about it yet. But yeah, hi.
I guess I have a little bit of a conceptual problem here.
Okay.
I find the idea of stance error very interesting, but is the error, it's in quotation marks, but is the error like that it's taking the wrong stance or that it's giving a stance in the first place? Because like if the error is that it's giving a stance, like that's implying that there's some sort of unbiased fact that you can provide.
Yeah, I would say pretty strongly, like I actually don't know many journalists. I think that like the literature on objectivity in journalism has largely moved on to say, and STS literature on scientific objectivity would tell us this too, that I would not say that there's a thing called objectivity that they just need to do better. Like that's not what all language is politics, politics is language, like that. I don't think you can separate those two in any way. I would not argue for that. And this is why I think Shudson's mature subjectivity point is the reason I bring it up here. Is like I think this is the intervention Shudson's kind of making. So his sort of quasi-famous line was to say, mature subjectivity is commitment to facts, a commitment to values, and a commitment to knowing the difference between those two things. And that's what journalism's version of mature subjectivity would be. Is that. So for Shudson, that's what, quote, a good journalist would be. So no, I don't think this is an error that needs to be fixed. And in fact, the act of fixing it is a stance, right? The act is to do that. And that's fine. I'm not making a normative judgment about it. But let's just sort of eyes wide open as we move into this, sort of world of, supposed, because, synthetically generated news language. I guess my worry, I'm clearly just talking it through, my worry in a way is that I do talk to a lot of journalists who, have not read about mechanical objectivity and Daston and Gallison. Like they don't have this criticality to say, these things are not objective. Like they literally will sort of use ChatGPT and be sort of like, well, it's producing an algorithmic result that is coming from a computational system that is disinterested, and they might not use the word objective, but I think there is a willingness to accept some of these systems as being apolitical or not having apolitics at all. And I think people who study technology would say, of course, this is embedded in politics. It grows out of politics. It's all politics. It's all embedded and tangled with it. Recognizing stance language is about just the politics of news language. It's saying, yeah, these are always political choices to use this kind of language.
Okay.
Sorry, I'm getting way too long answers. I apologize. This is indulgent for me. I really appreciate this.
And it's so nice that you're like running ideas. It's
I-
so rarely that there's like an actual question on the table. When,
I'm on sabbatical. I have no one to talk to, so I think I'm just. It's lovely.
Thank you so much, Mike.
Thank you all. Thank you. I really appreciate it. Thank you.